A man who spent his life prosecuting criminals does not usually disappear without leaving a trail. Yet sometimes, the most disturbing crimes are not defined by violence, but by silence. Imagine dedicating decades to uncovering the truth, only to become a mystery yourself, erased from the world without a final word. Today's story takes us to Pennsylvania, where Ray Gricar, a respected district attorney, vanished in 2005 under circumstances that still defy explanation. What began as a routine missing person report quickly became an unsolved mystery, shaped by missing evidence, destroyed digital records, institutional power, and deliberate silence. Beneath Gricar's disappearance lies a darker and more complex history. His career placed him near sensitive investigations, political pressure, and decisions that carried lasting consequences. Personal trauma followed him quietly, while professional restraint masked internal conflict. This is not a story defined by what can be proven, but by what remains obscured. And sometimes, the truths that never surface speak far louder than any confession ever could. Pennsylvania often presents itself as a place untouched by urgency, where time moves slowly and stability is assumed rather than questioned. In its smaller counties, routine becomes a form of comfort. Courthouses open on schedule, cases follow familiar patterns, and trust is built not through transparency, but through repetition. Center County embodied this atmosphere perfectly. Its courthouse stood as a symbol of continuity, a place where justice felt procedural and predictable. From the outside, there was no indication that anything beneath this calm surface was unstable. Everything appeared orderly, measured, and safe. Until, suddenly, it was not. Ray Gricar lived and worked within this environment for decades. He did not disrupt it. He reinforced it. By the time he disappeared, he was 59 years old and had served as the district attorney of Center County since 1985. His tenure alone made him an institution. In local legal circles, Gricar was not seen as a rising figure or an ambitious politician. He was seen as permanent. His presence was expected, his authority unquestioned, his routines familiar. That sense of permanence would later make his disappearance even more difficult to comprehend. Professionally, Gricar was known for restraint rather than charisma. He avoided public attention whenever possible and rarely granted interviews. Unlike many prosecutors who cultivate visibility to advance their careers, Gricar appeared indifferent to political optics. He did not campaign aggressively, nor did he frame himself as a moral crusader. Colleagues described him as reserved, meticulous, and deeply private. He preferred written communication to verbal discussion and relied heavily on documentation. Decisions were deliberate, often slow, and rarely emotional. This was not accidental. Gricar's professional identity was built around control. He believed the legal system required emotional distance to function properly, and he applied that belief inward as rigorously as he applied it outward. He avoided speculation, refused to comment on ongoing investigations, and declined high-profile cases when he believed evidence did not meet prosecutorial standards. In a system that often rewards visibility and boldness, Gricar practiced refusal. That refusal earned him respect among some peers and quiet resentment among others. Yet beneath this composed exterior existed a personal history shaped by trauma. Years earlier, Gricar's older brother had died by suicide. While Ray Gricar rarely spoke about it publicly, those close to him later recalled that the event deeply affected his worldview. When he did mention his brother, it was not with visible grief, but with unease. The fear was not of death itself, but of unresolved endings. He feared silence. He feared disappearance without explanation. Most notably, he feared losing control over how one's life was interpreted after it ended. Psychologically, this history matters. Individuals who experience familial suicide often develop heightened sensitivity to ambiguity and loss of narrative control. In Gricar's case, this appeared to manifest as emotional containment. Franz described him as disciplined to the point of rigidity. He maintained strict routines, limited emotional exposure, and compartmentalized personal pain. These traits align with what psychologists describe as high-functioning anxiety masked by structure. Such individuals do not appear unstable. They appear dependable, but internally, they rely on order to suppress unresolved fear. These coping mechanisms allowed Gricar to function effectively in high-pressure legal environments. They also isolated him. He was known by many, but truly understood by few. Emotional distance, while protective, creates invisibility. When someone like that disappears, there are fewer emotional reference points to interpret the event. The absence feels larger because the person was already partially absent. Inside the courthouse, Gricar controlled more than legal outcomes. He controlled information. As district attorney, he had access to files involving political misconduct, financial crimes, and allegations against influential individuals. Some of these cases he pursued aggressively. Others, he declined to prosecute without detailed public explanation. While this discretion was legally permissible, it attracted attention. In hindsight, those decisions appear more significant than they did at the time. The people around Gricar formed a complex psychological orbit. Colleagues respected his intellect but found him difficult to read. Subordinates trusted his judgment but rarely understood his reasoning. Former defendants often described him as cold, procedural, and unmoved by persuasion. Importantly, no one described him as impulsive or reckless. If anything, the dominant psychological profile that emerges is one of caution bordering on rigidity. This distinction is critical. Reckless individuals disappear easily. They act impulsively, underestimate risk, and leave trails of emotional volatility. Careful individuals do not. When they vanish, it suggests either extreme internal conflict or external interference. In Gricar's case, both possibilities remain open. Center County itself contributed to the illusion of safety. It was a community where neighbors recognized each other's vehicles and routines replaced suspicion. Yet history demonstrates that small communities often conceal secrets more effectively than large cities. Social cohesion discourages confrontation. Questions are softened by familiarity. Silence spreads quickly when everyone knows everyone else. Behind closed doors, political pressure circulated quietly. Certain cases connected to powerful institutions were rumored but never publicly confirmed. Gricar's refusal to prosecute some high-profile matters raised questions, particularly after later scandals revealed deeper corruption tied to those same institutions. Whether Gricar possessed damaging knowledge or simply adhered strictly to evidentiary standards remains unknown. But psychologically, the burden of proximity to potential wrongdoing carries weight. Knowledge creates responsibility, and responsibility creates strain. Over time, that strain demands release. For some, release comes through confession, for others, through withdrawal, and for a very small number, through disappearance. As the years passed, Ray Gricar carried his secrets alone. His life appeared stable. His career seemed secure. But stability, in psychological terms, is not always peace. Sometimes it is sustained tension, maintained through discipline and silence. And tension, when left unresolved, does not dissolve. It waits. When Ray Gricar finally vanished, the shock did not come from chaos. It came from the collapse of certainty. A man defined by control had removed himself from every known system, and in doing so, he left behind not answers, but a vacuum, one that still resists explanation. April 15, 2005, began without any sense of rupture. There were no warnings, no visible fractures in routine, no behaviors that would later feel obviously prophetic. Ray Gricar moved through the morning as he had countless mornings before, following habits shaped by decades of discipline. He spoke calmly to those around him, showed no outward agitation, and displayed none of the emotional volatility typically associated with crises. To anyone observing him casually, it was an ordinary day. And in the study of disappearance, ordinary days are often the most deceptive. There were no reports of raised voices, no signs of anxiety, no sudden disengagement from responsibilities. Gricar attended to his obligations with the same measured restraint that defined his professional identity. Psychologically, this matters. Acute emotional breakdowns rarely hide themselves completely. They leave traces in tone, posture, timing. In Gricar's case, those traces were notably absent. The day did not begin with chaos. It began with quiet consistency. Before leaving, Gricar spoke with his girlfriend and told her that he wanted to take a drive alone. He explained that he needed time to think. The statement was simple, almost banal, and at the time it raised no concern. He had taken solitary drives before, often using them as a way to process stress privately. In retrospect, however, that sentence became one of the most analyzed moments of the case. From a psychological perspective, the desire for solitude can signal many things. It can indicate reflection, withdrawal, or preparation. It can also indicate nothing more than routine self-regulation. The key factor is context. In Gricar's case, There was no accompanying behavior to clarify intent. He did not express despair. He did not articulate fear. He did not hint at finality. The ambiguity of that moment continues to resist interpretation. What Ray Gricar did not do carries equal weight. He packed no belongings, withdrew no money, and left no messages or instructions. These omissions undermine both impulsive escape and deliberate disappearance theories. Behavioral analysis shows neither panic nor preparation. Instead, his actions reflect ambiguity. They point not toward a clear decision, but toward a moment suspended between intention and uncertainty. Gricar drove toward Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, a town he was familiar with and had visited before. This was not an unfamiliar destination chosen at random. It was a place embedded in his personal geography, one that did not immediately signal escape or concealment. Surveillance footage later placed him there, walking calmly, appearing unhurried, and showing no visible signs of distress. He did not appear to be meeting anyone. He did not appear to be avoiding anyone. His movements were unremarkable. No witnesses reported arguments or confrontations. No one described him as fearful or disoriented. There were no frantic phone calls, no sudden deviations from normal behavior. The timeline simply ends. In disappearance cases, quiet endings are often the most disturbing, because they offer no emotional cues to guide interpretation. The absence of drama removes narrative comfort. Soon after, Gricar's vehicle was discovered near the Susquehanna River. The location immediately shaped investigative assumptions. Rivers offer a convenient explanation for absence, especially in cases where bodies are not recovered. Inside the vehicle, investigators found nothing overtly incriminating. There were no signs of violence, no evidence of struggle, no personal effects arranged in a symbolic way. The scene did not communicate intent. The intact scene suggested that Ray Gricar left his vehicle by choice, not by force. Such order matters, as coerced removal almost always leaves traces of disruption. Nearby, investigators recovered his laptop from the river, its hard drive intentionally destroyed beyond recovery. This single act changed everything. Deliberate data destruction reflects awareness, planning, and concealment. If suicide were the goal, erasing digital information would have been unnecessary, as death alone would have ensured privacy. Investigators were left with a contradiction. The act of destroying the laptop suggested foresight and control, while the absence of other preparatory behaviors suggested uncertainty. This duality complicated every conclusion. Suicide narratives rely on emotional indicators. Disappearance narratives rely on logistical indicators. Gricar's case offered neither cleanly. No body was ever recovered. No suicide note was ever found. No definitive evidence confirmed death. The river became the default explanation, not because it was proven, but because it was plausible. Yet plausibility is not proof. Rivers are often used to close cases, not solve them. They absorb uncertainty and return silence. As time passed, investigators faced a paradox. Every explanation seemed reasonable at a distance, but collapsed under scrutiny. Suicide raised questions about the destroyed data. Murder raised questions about the lack of struggle and evidence. Voluntary disappearance raised questions about resources and preparation. Each theory explained one part of the case, while contradicting another. The absence of closure created a vacuum, and vacuums invite speculation. Was Ray Gricar a man who chose silence over shame? Was he silenced by others who feared what he knew? Or was he someone who believed that disappearance itself could be a form of control, a way to resolve conflict without confrontation? Psychologically, the idea of disappearance as control is not as rare as it seems. For individuals whose identities are built on authority and restraint, vanishing can represent the final assertion of agency. It removes the individual from judgment, narrative, and consequence. It is not an escape from responsibility, but a refusal to continue participating in a system perceived as irreconcilable. By the time authorities officially classified the case as a presumed suicide, doubt had already taken root. Family members objected. Observers questioned the logic. Journalists revisited inconsistencies. The classification did not close the case. It merely shifted it into administrative stillness. And doubt, once planted, rarely dies. What remains most disturbing is not the lack of answers, but the precision of uncertainty. Ray Gricar vanished from within routine and order, not chaos. The case resists explanation because its evidence points in conflicting directions. Some disappearances are not puzzles meant to be solved. They are deliberate silences, shaped by intention, waiting not for resolution, but for understanding. When Ray Gricar vanished in April 2005, the investigation did not unfold with the urgency typically reserved for the disappearance of a senior public official. Instead, it moved quietly, shaped less by evidence than by early assumptions. From the outset, law enforcement gravitated toward a familiar explanation, one that required minimal disruption to institutional stability. Suicide was never immediately declared, yet it became the unspoken framework guiding nearly every decision that followed. Once an investigation settles on a narrative early, it rarely seeks evidence that might undermine it. In Gricar's case, this subtle narrowing of perspective would have lasting consequences. Investigators focused heavily on Gricar's personal history, particularly the suicide of his older brother decades earlier. From a psychological standpoint, this emphasis was understandable but incomplete. Familial suicide can increase vulnerability, but it does not function as destiny. Trauma does not operate on a predictable timeline, nor does it override years of disciplined coping strategies. Ray Gricar had built his adult life around structure, restraint, and professional distance. Yet this single detail became the emotional cornerstone of a theory that felt orderly and reassuring, even if it lacked depth. This early bias began to shape how evidence was interpreted. The destruction of Gricar's laptop, for instance, was framed as a symbolic final act, an attempt to control his narrative before ending his life. The absence of a suicide note was explained away as a personal quirk consistent with his private nature. The lack of a body was attributed to the Susquehanna River, whose currents conveniently accounted for physical absence. Each gap in evidence was filled not with investigation, but with inference. This is how cold cases are often created, not through negligence or malice, but through narrative convenience. As weeks turned into months, the official investigation lost momentum. In that vacuum, the media stepped in. Journalists began scrutinizing Ray Gricar's career, not simply to understand the man, but to search for contradictions between his public role and his private decisions. What emerged was a pattern that had circulated quietly within legal and political circles for years. As district attorney, Gricar had declined to prosecute several sensitive cases involving influential institutions and individuals. At the time, these decisions attracted little attention. In hindsight, they took on new significance. The most cited example involved Ray Gricar's response to early allegations against Jerry Sandusky at Penn State. Years before the scandal became public, reports reached his office. He declined prosecution, citing insufficient evidence. Legally sound, the decision carried psychological weight. It placed him between provable fact and moral suspicion, a boundary that generates lasting internal tension. For prosecutors, few positions are more psychologically demanding than standing between law, conscience, and irreversible consequence. Public response intensified as these details resurfaced. Speculation grew that Gricar possessed knowledge he never revealed, not from sensationalism, but from dissatisfaction with official explanations. Efforts to assert closure only deepened doubt, turning silence into suspicion. His family firmly rejected suicide, citing his continued engagement with work and future plans. While not definitive, this behavior complicates that narrative. As scrutiny increased, three dominant theories emerged, each grounded in a different psychological interpretation of his disappearance. The first theory argues that Gricar planned his suicide carefully. Proponents suggest he feared eventual exposure, professional disgrace, or legal repercussions tied to past prosecutorial decisions. The destruction of the laptop supports this interpretation, implying a desire to control information and legacy. Psychologically, this aligns with traits such as perfectionism, fear of reputational loss, and a need for closure on one's own terms. Yet this theory collides with an uncomfortable contradiction. Gricar had openly expressed fear of repeating his brother's fate. Suicide would have mirrored the very outcome he had spent decades trying to distance himself from. The second theory proposes homicide disguised as disappearance. His interpretation focuses on motive and opportunity. Gricar's position granted him access to sensitive information that could have threatened powerful interests. If he posed a risk, silencing him would have been effective. The absence of physical evidence could suggest professional involvement, someone capable of leaving no trace. However, this theory requires extraordinary precision. Crimes of such complexity almost always leave behind anomalies, financial irregularities, witness inconsistencies, or forensic remnants. While absence of evidence is not proof of absence, it demands caution. The third theory is perhaps the most psychologically unsettling. It suggests that Ray Gricar chose to disappear not to die, but to erase himself. This would require meticulous planning, emotional detachment, and possibly external assistance. From a psychological standpoint, it implies extreme internal conflict, paired with a belief that withdrawal was the only viable resolution. For a man defined by control, disappearance could represent the ultimate assertion of agency. Yet this theory raises its own questions. Sustaining a new identity requires ongoing risk, adaptability, and social engagement traits that conflict with Gricar's reserved and rigid personality. None of the prevailing theories withstands scrutiny on its own. Each accounts for certain details while leaving others unresolved. A later witness account further unsettled every explanation, describing Gricar as calm and purposeful, not distressed. Though inconclusive, it challenges the emotional logic of suicide. Over time, the investigation faded into exhaustion. Public interest waned, resources shifted, and the case became a cold file, defined less by missing facts than by facts that refused to align. Ray Gricar gradually transformed from a missing person into a symbol. His disappearance exposed the limits of institutional investigation, the subtle power of cognitive bias, and the discomfort society feels when faced with unanswered questions. Over time, a troubling realization emerged. Perhaps the truth was not buried beneath layers of complexity. Perhaps it was hidden in plain sight, protected by silence willingly maintained. Theories collapse when they are forced to confront human contradiction. And contradiction is precisely where this case resides, between order and chaos, control and surrender, knowledge and restraint. Ray Gricar's disappearance remains unresolved, not because it lacks explanations, but because each explanation reveals something unsettling about power, psychology, and the cost of knowing too much. To understand the disappearance of Ray Gricar, it is no longer sufficient to reconstruct timelines or catalog physical evidence. Those elements have been examined repeatedly, yet they fail to produce coherence. What remains is the psychological terrain, shaped by prolonged pressure, moral responsibility, and the quiet fear of losing control. In unresolved cases like this, psychology rarely provides definitive answers. Instead, it defines limits, revealing what an individual could tolerate internally and what ultimately exceeded that threshold. Ray Gricar lived within a system that rewarded restraint and punished error. As a long-serving district attorney, he occupied a role where decisions were rarely neutral. Each choice carried consequences not only for defendants, but for institutions, reputations, and public trust. Over time, this produces a form of psychological compression. Power is often mistaken for freedom, yet sustained authority narrows options rather than expanding them. The higher the position, the fewer exits exist that do not cause damage. Psychologists describe this condition as control stress. It emerges when an individual feels personally responsible for maintaining order, even when that order is inherently unstable. Control ceases to be a tool and becomes identity. For someone like Gricar, whose personality favored discipline and predictability, the law was not merely a profession. It was a psychological structure. It organized chaos, provided boundaries, and justified restraint. Losing faith in that structure would not have felt like professional doubt. It would have felt existential. People with strong control orientation rarely exhibit outward breakdown. They do not display impulsivity or emotional volatility. Instead, conflict is internalized. Fear is managed through routine. Doubt is suppressed through procedure. Vulnerability is reframed as failure. Gricar's avoidance of public attention, his reliance on written communication, and his refusal to speculate publicly all reflect this pattern. These behaviors are adaptive in high-pressure environments, but they also isolate. Isolation increases the risk that conflict will remain unresolved. Alongside control stress operates another powerful force, fear of reputational collapse. In legal and political spheres, reputation functions as currency, and once damaged, it cannot be fully restored through explanation. For individuals whose identity is rooted in integrity, reputational death can feel worse than physical disappearance. Silence becomes protection against reinterpretation rather than danger. This fear is relevant to Gricar, whose refusal to prosecute certain cases later linked to major scandals may have carried lasting psychological weight. Moral doubt does not require guilt. It only requires uncertainty. Moral psychology helps explain this tension. Individuals who hold themselves to absolute ethical standards often experience what clinicians call responsibility distortion. They overestimate their personal accountability for outcomes that are, in reality, systemic. In such cases, self-punishment can feel justified, even necessary. The person does not perceive themselves as a victim of circumstance. They see themselves as a variable that must be managed, minimized, or removed to prevent further harm. This is where psychological analysis intersects with theology. In Christian moral thought, guilt is not merely an emotion. It is a condition tied to conscience and responsibility. Redemption traditionally requires confession, but confession demands exposure. For someone who believes that exposure would harm others or destabilize institutions, silence can feel like the only ethical option. Withdrawal becomes a form of penance. Disappearance becomes containment rather than escape. Christian theology also contains the concept of redemptive suffering, the belief that enduring pain silently can serve a higher moral purpose. This idea does not require devout religiosity. It requires moral absolutism, the belief that one's own suffering can prevent greater harm. If Gricar believed that his knowledge, decisions, or silence had contributed to future damage, he may have viewed his own removal as an act of moral control. This interpretation does not assume innocence or guilt. It assumes responsibility taken to an extreme. From a psychological standpoint, this aligns with patterns observed in individuals who choose withdrawal over confrontation. These individuals do not act impulsively. They plan carefully. They eliminate variables. They attempt to reduce impact. The destruction of Gricar's laptop fits within this framework. From a cognitive perspective, what a person chooses to erase often reveals more than what they choose to preserve. Erasure signals intent, not confusion. If the case is ever to be re-examined meaningfully, investigative approaches must move beyond assumptions of emotional collapse. Instead, they should focus on cognitive patterns and decision-making frameworks. Revisiting the destroyed data is not merely a technical challenge, it is a psychological one. Metadata, access histories, and partial fragments could provide insight into what Gricar considered dangerous enough to eliminate. The goal would not be content, but intention. Re-examining the cases Gricar declined to prosecute is psychologically significant, not to assign blame, but to measure internal burden. Certain decisions may have carried unresolved moral tension. Patterns may emerge where restraint consistently overruled action. As repeated restraint can accumulate psychological cost, especially when later events intensify doubt. The consequences of unresolved disappearance extend far beyond the individual. Gricar's family remains suspended in a state known as ambiguous loss. This condition occurs when there is no confirmation of death, no certainty of survival, and no narrative to complete grief. Psychologically ambiguous loss is more corrosive than bereavement. Without resolution, the mind cannot close its internal loops. Hope and despair coexist, preventing healing. The justice system also absorbs the impact of absence. When a guardian of law disappears without explanation, it exposes institutional vulnerability. It suggests that even those entrusted with truth can be consumed by it. Public trust erodes, not necessarily through scandal, but through incompleteness. Justice relies on resolution. When resolution is absent, justice becomes symbolic rather than functional. At the core of this case lies a question that defies simplicity. Did Ray Gricar vanish to escape consequences, or to contain them? Was this the loss of a man, or the suppression of knowledge deemed too disruptive to emerge? Psychology offers no final answer, only the cost of each possibility. Silence is never empty. It carries intention and weight. Whether Gricar is gone or hidden, his absence redistributed tension rather than ending it. And sometimes, the mind seeks containment over survival. The story of Ray Gricar ends without resolution, like a piece of music that fades before its final note is played. There is no body, no confession, no definitive truth to hold on to. What remains is absence, carefully shaped and deeply unsettling. Gricar is no longer just a missing man. He has become a symbol of the truths that never surface, the knowledge that carries weight too heavy for daylight. His disappearance forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice and power. What happens when those tasked with guarding the truth are themselves consumed by it? What is the price of knowing too much, and who ultimately pays that price? In this case, silence feels intentional, almost engineered, leaving behind a chill that logic cannot easily dispel. As the years pass, the case does not age. It lingers, unresolved, echoing in the gaps between evidence and belief. If this story made you reflect on the hidden costs of truth, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to continue exploring unsolved cases that refuse to rest. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Minds.